Dedication to my parents, who I love very dearly. Until quite recently, America has stood as a beacon of hope, a testament to the strength and resilience of a republic built on the principles of liberty, equality, and justice for all. As a citizen of this great nation, I have always believed in the fundamental goodness and enduring promise of the American experiment. It is with this deep-seated love and unwavering hope that I present to you American Downfall, Democracy on the Brink. This book is a work of fiction. It is grounded in a profound respect for our country and a sincere desire to remind us of the fragility and preciousness of our democratic institutions. As we journey through the tumultuous events of 2036, we will witness a nation in crisis, a country on the brink of tearing itself apart under the weight of political division, social unrest, and the actions of its leaders. Through the story of President Digby "Bud" Taraxia, we explore the complexities and challenges that threaten the very fabric of our democracy. His controversial presidency, marked by decisive actions and controversial decisions, serves as a poignant reminder of how easily the pillars of our society can be shaken. The book delves into themes of power, accountability, and the delicate balance required to maintain the trust and unity of a diverse populace. American Downfall is not just a cautionary tale, it is a call to action. It is an urgent reminder that our democracy requires constant vigilance, active participation, and an unwavering commitment to the values upon which our nation was founded. The events depicted in this book are a reflection of the potential consequences of neglecting these responsibilities. As you turn the pages of this graphic novel, I hope you are inspired to hold tightly to our beloved democracy. Let it serve as a reminder that the strength of our nation lies not just in our institutions, but in the collective will of its people to uphold and protect them. Together, we can ensure that America remains a land of freedom and opportunity for generations to come. Prior to diving into the fictional chapters that follow this introduction, please consider the following quotes by Barbara F. Walter, author of the 2022 book, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. Quote number 1. People may tolerate years of poverty, unemployment, and discrimination. They may accept shoddy schools, poor hospitals, and neglected infrastructure. But there is one thing they will not tolerate: losing status in a place they believe is theirs. In the 21st century, the most dangerous factions are once dominant groups facing decline. Quote number 2. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Walters also draws attention to a very poignant term, anocracy. In an anocracy, citizens receive some elements of democratic rule, perhaps full voting rights, but they are actually living under leaders with extensive authoritarian powers and few checks and balances. Is America presently transitioning to an anocracy? After all, mixed with both timing and circumstance, it now risks destruction from tyrannical and feeble-minded leaders alike. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Let us cherish our republic and work tirelessly to preserve it. Joshua Kappelman. President Digby "Bud" Taraxia stood in the Oval Office, his gaze fixed on the panoramic windows that framed the hellish landscape outside. Washington, D.C., the heart of American democracy, was engulfed in flames. The once majestic skyline was obscured by billowing plumes of smoke, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning debris. Fires raged uncontrollably through the streets, casting an eerie orange glow over the city. Buildings that had stood for centuries were now crumbling husks, their windows shattered and interiors gutted by the inferno. In the days following the controversial election, the nation had teetered on the brink of chaos. Allegations of fraud and corruption had polarized the populace, sparking protests that quickly escalated into riots. The National Guard, deployed to restore order, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the mobs. Clashes between protesters and law enforcement were brutal and unrelenting, each night more violent than the last. Amidst the turmoil, the foundations of the government seemed to tremble, and a sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air. As the flames consumed the city, President Taraxia turned away from the window and surveyed the Oval Office. His mind raced with the enormity of the task before him. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on his shoulders, but beneath his composed exterior, a fierce resolve burned. He believed in his vision for America, a vision that had driven him to pursue the highest office in the land. Yet, as the riots raged on, he couldn't escape the nagging fear that his actions might have set the stage for the very destruction he now sought to avert. The president glanced at the array of screens displaying live feeds from around the city. Each one showed scenes of chaos, looting, fires, and violent clashes between protesters and troops. He wondered if the soldiers he had ordered to surround the White House would be able to keep him safe much longer. The thought of departing the White House in Marine One, his presidential helicopter, crossed his mind. It was a contingency plan he hoped he would never have to execute. Outside, the sounds of gunfire and explosions were a constant reminder of the city's descent into anarchy. Taraxia knew that his next moves would shape the future of the country. His decisions, made in the coming days and weeks, would either restore order or plunge the nation into deeper chaos. The embers of division had been stoked to a roaring blaze, and the choices he made now would either douse the flames or fan them into an inferno. In the midst of this turmoil, the president's closest advisers and the nation's top military leaders awaited his command. Taraxia knew that he needed to act decisively, but the path forward was fraught with peril. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the eyes of the nation watching and waiting. As dawn approached, casting a dim light over the ravaged city, President Taraxia steeled himself for the challenges ahead. He was determined to navigate this crisis, to bring the nation back from the brink, even as the echoes of dissent and discord reverberated through the halls of power. The era of uncertainty had begun, and at its heart stood a president grappling with his own legacy amidst the eruption of chaos.
Digby Bud Taraxia's childhood was a far cry from the chaos he now faced as president. Raised in the opulent surroundings of his family's estate in Austin, Texas, Bud's early years were steeped in privilege and excess. The sprawling mansion, with its manicured lawns and lavish interiors, was a testament to the immense wealth his father had amassed. Private tutors provided his education, ensuring that he received the best possible instruction. Exclusive country clubs and high society galas were the backdrop to his formative years, creating an environment where he was insulated from the struggles of ordinary Americans. Bud's father, Digby Taraxia Sr., was a towering figure in his life. A British immigrant who had made a fortune in the controversial and highly lucrative AI sex and pornography industry, Digby Sr. was a man of formidable ambition and intellect. Unable to become president due to his foreign birth, he channeled his aspirations into the political arena, eventually becoming the governor of Texas. The relationship between father and son was complex, characterized by a mixture of admiration, competition, and a shared vision for power. Digby Sr. was a demanding parent, instilling in Bud a relentless drive for success and an unyielding belief in their family's destiny to shape the nation. Dinner table conversations often revolved around politics, strategy, and the mechanics of power. From an early age, Bud absorbed his father's lessons on leadership, control, and the importance of maintaining a strong public image. Despite the sometimes harsh and demanding nature of their relationship, there was an undeniable bond between them. Digby Sr. saw in Bud the realization of his own unfulfilled dreams, and he groomed his son to carry the torch forward. Together, they shared a vision of political dominance, with Bud's future presidency as the ultimate goal. Even as a child, Bud exhibited signs of the authoritarian tendencies that would later define his presidency. He was known among his peers for his strong-willed nature and a penchant for taking charge. School projects, sports teams, and social clubs all saw Bud stepping into leadership roles, often imposing his will on others with an iron fist. His methods were effective but ruthless, prioritizing results over relationships and fostering a culture of fear and obedience. At home, Bud's desire for control extended to every aspect of his life. He meticulously planned his days, set rigorous schedules, and demanded perfection from himself and those around him. His father's influence was evident in his approach to leadership, calculating, strategic, and often uncompromising. One of the earliest manifestations of Bud's authoritarian streak came during his teenage years, when he organized and led a campaign to overhaul the student council at his private school. Dissatisfied with what he saw as inefficiency and weakness, Bud orchestrated a takeover that replaced the existing leadership with his hand-picked allies. The new regime implemented strict rules, curfews, and disciplinary measures that, while increasing order and efficiency, also stifled dissent and creativity. These early experiences shaped Bud's worldview, reinforcing his belief in the necessity of strong, centralized authority. His father's teachings and his own natural inclinations combined to create a leader who valued power and control above all else. As he grew older, these tendencies only intensified, laying the groundwork for the controversial and tumultuous presidency that would follow. In these formative years, the seeds of Digby Bud Taraxia's future were sown. His upbringing and privilege, the profound influence of his father, and his own inherent drive for control set the stage for a life defined by ambition and authority. As the flames of Washington, D.C. burned outside the White House, the memories of his past echoed in his mind, reminding him of the path that had ultimately led him to this pivotal moment.
The once vibrant streets of Washington, D.C. had transformed into a nightmare of violence and destruction. Fires raged unchecked, engulfing historic buildings and casting a hellish glow over the city. Smoke billowed into the night sky, mingling with the distant wail of sirens and the ominous thud of explosions. In every direction, chaos reigned. Protesters, their faces obscured by masks and scarves, hurled rocks and Molotov cocktails at riot police, who responded with tear gas and rubber bullets. The clash between the two sides was brutal and relentless, with neither willing to yield. Storefronts were smashed, their contents looted by frenzied mobs. Vehicles lay overturned and burning, adding to the cacophony of destruction. Among the ruins, ordinary citizens huddled in their homes, terrified by the anarchy unfolding outside their doors. The city, a symbol of democratic ideals, now stood as a testament to the fragility of order and the depth of division tearing the nation apart. As the city burned, law enforcement and government officials scrambled to respond to the escalating crisis. Inside the White House Situation Room, President Taraxia and his top advisors engaged in heated discussions, their faces etched with urgency and concern. The president's resolve to maintain control was evident, but the path forward was anything but clear. General Lyle, appearing via video link, reported on the National Guard's efforts to quell the riots. His voice was steady, but the strain was apparent. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. President, but the scale of this unrest is unprecedented. We need more resources, more manpower." Detective Ramirez, on the ground in one of the city's hardest-hit districts, provided a starkly different perspective. "We're losing control out here," she relayed through a secure line to her superiors. "The violence is escalating by the minute. We need immediate reinforcements, but we also need a strategy that addresses the protesters' grievances. This can't be solved by force alone." In her Capitol Hill office, Senator Hayes dialed into the emergency session of Congress, urging her colleagues to act swiftly and decisively. "We must address the root causes of this unrest," she implored. "The election controversy has torn this nation apart, and our people need to see that their voices are heard and their concerns are taken seriously." Meanwhile, Jacob Mason, hiding in a makeshift command center set up in a basement, communicated with fellow activists via encrypted messages. "We can't let this violence overshadow our cause," he warned. "But we also can't stand down. We need to find a way to channel this anger into constructive action before it's too late." The cacophony of voices, each representing a different facet of the unfolding crisis, highlighted the immense complexity of the situation. Law enforcement struggled to balance the need for order with the rights of the citizens they were sworn to protect. Government officials wrestled with political and ethical dilemmas, their decisions made under the relentless pressure of an unfolding catastrophe. President Taraxia, watching the chaos from the safety of the Oval Office, felt the weight of the nation's future bearing down on him. He knew that his next moves would be critical, not just for his presidency, but for the survival of the very democracy he had vowed to protect. The eruption of chaos was a test of leadership, resolve, and the nation's ability to navigate through its darkest hour. As the night wore on, the city continued to burn, and the struggle for control became ever more desperate. The threads of the nation's fabric were unraveling, and the leaders of the free world were faced with the monumental task of stitching them back together before it was too late. The present chaos of Washington, D.C. faded as President Digby Bud Taraxia's thoughts drifted back to his adolescence. He remembered the sprawling estate in Austin, Texas, where he had spent his formative years. The estate, with its stately columns and manicured gardens, was a fortress of privilege and power. It was here, amid the trappings of wealth, that Bud's vision of his future began to take shape. The Toroxia family was synonymous with influence and affluence. Digby Toroxia Sr., Bud's father, had amassed a considerable fortune in the controversial AI sex and pornography industry. His empire was built on the cutting edge of technology and the fringes of morality, and it brought with it not just wealth, but notoriety. Despite the whispers and judgments from polite society, Digby Sr.'s success was undeniable, and it opened doors that few others could pass through. Bud's upbringing was steeped in the understanding that power and money could shape the world. From a young age, he was exposed to high-level political and business dealings, often sitting quietly in his father's study as influential figures came and went. The lessons were implicit. Control, dominance, and the relentless pursuit of one's goals were paramount. This environment instilled in Bud a belief in the inevitability of his own ascendancy. Living in luxury, Bud grew accustomed to the privileges that his family's wealth afforded him. Exclusive private schools, vacations to exotic locations, and interactions with the elite shaped his worldview. He learned early on that influence could be wielded like a weapon, and that the world respected power and wealth. Several key experiences and relationships during Bud's adolescence forged his character and aspirations. One of the most significant was his relationship with his father. Digby Sr. was a demanding figure, a man who expected nothing less than excellence from his son. Their interactions were often more like those between a mentor and protege than between a father and son. Bud admired his father's strategic mind and unwavering determination, but he also felt the pressure to live up to his legacy. Another pivotal influence was Bud's experience at the exclusive boarding school he attended. There, he honed his skills in debate and leadership, often taking charge of school projects and organizations. It was during these years that his authoritarian tendencies began to surface. Bud learned that the most efficient way to achieve his goals was through control and manipulation, and he didn't hesitate to use these tactics to his advantage. A defining moment came when Bud decided to run for student body president. His campaign was a masterclass in strategic maneuvering, leveraging his family's influence and resources to secure a decisive victory. This experience solidified his belief in his ability to lead and his destiny to hold power. During these years, Bud also formed a close-knit group of friends who shared his ambitions and worldview. Among them was Ethan Crawford, a brilliant yet ruthless young man who would later become Bud's chief advisor. Their friendship was built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of the mechanics of power. Together, they envisioned a future where they would rise to the pinnacle of American politics. Back in the present, as the Capitol burned and the nation teetered on the edge, those early lessons in ambition and authority echoed in President Toroxia's mind. The path that had brought him to the presidency was paved with the principles he had learned in his youth, and now, more than ever, he would need to draw on that foundation to steer the country through its darkest hour. During his formative years, Digby Bud Toroxia encountered several influential figures who profoundly shaped his political ideology. Among them was Senator James Maxwell, a family friend and frequent guest at the Toroxia estate. Senator Maxwell was known for his hardline stances and persuasive oratory, which captivated young Bud. Through countless dinner conversations and private discussions, Maxwell imparted his views on governance, power, and the importance of a strong, central authority. Another key figure was Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, a renowned political scientist and advisor to many influential politicians. She mentored Bud during his college years, offering him a blend of academic rigor and practical political strategy. Dr. Whitmore's emphasis on the manipulation of public perception and the utilization of media to shape narratives left a lasting impression on Bud. These figures, along with others in the orbit of his father's social and political network, provided Bud with a comprehensive understanding of the complexities of power and governance. They instilled in him a belief in the necessity of decisive leadership and the often harsh realities of political life. Digby Toroxia Sr.'s influence on Bud was profound and unrelenting. As a man who had built a controversial yet lucrative empire, Digby Sr.'s expectations for his son were steeped in ambition and the pursuit of greatness. He envisioned a future where Bud would ascend to the highest echelons of political power, compensating for the limitations he himself faced as a non-naturalized citizen. From a young age, Bud was subjected to rigorous training in leadership, negotiation, and strategic thinking. Digby Sr. arranged for his son to meet with prominent business leaders, politicians, and thinkers, ensuring that Bud absorbed a wealth of knowledge and insight. The elder Taraxia's guidance was often harsh, pushing Bud to exceed his limits and develop a relentless work ethic. "Power is not given, it's taken," his father would often say, a mantra that Bud internalized deeply. This relentless drive, coupled with the high expectations placed upon him, forged a character that was ambitious, determined, and sometimes ruthless. Bud's early ambitions were fueled by his father's vision and the influential figures who shaped his ideology. Even as a teenager, Bud was determined to make his mark on American politics. He immersed himself in the study of history, political theory, and governance, always seeking to understand the mechanics of power and influence. In college, Bud excelled academically and politically. He quickly rose to prominence within student government, leveraging his connections and strategic acumen to secure leadership positions. His campaigns were meticulously planned and executed, showcasing his ability to navigate complex political landscapes. Bud's early ambitions were not limited to student politics. He interned for Senator Maxwell, gaining first-hand experience in legislative processes and political maneuvering. These experiences solidified his desire to pursue a career in politics, and he set his sights on the highest offices in the land. Driven by a combination of personal ambition and the weight of his father's expectations, Bud Taraxia embarked on a path that would eventually lead him to the presidency. His early years were characterized by a relentless pursuit of power and a clear vision of the impact he wanted to have on American politics. He was determined to leave a legacy, one that would reflect his belief in strong, authoritative leadership and the importance of maintaining control in the face of chaos. As he navigated the tumultuous waters of his presidency, these early experiences and lessons continued to guide him. The ambition that had been nurtured in the halls of his family's estate and the classrooms of elite institutions now drove his actions in the Oval Office, as he faced the greatest challenges of his career and the nation's history. As Bud Taraxia transitioned from adolescence to early adulthood, the harmonious relationship with his father, Digby Taraxia Sr., began to strain under the weight of differing visions for the future. While Digby Sr. envisioned a meticulously planned political trajectory for his son, Bud's ambitions started to diverge from the path his father had laid out. Digby Sr. saw politics as an extension of his business empire, a way to solidify and expand his influence. He imagined Bud as a governor, perhaps a senator, using their family's wealth and connections to methodically climb the political ladder. However, Bud, fueled by a sense of destiny and a desire to leave a monumental legacy, had his eyes set on the ultimate prize, the presidency. The tension between father and son grew palpable during heated discussions in Digby Sr.'s opulent study. "You're thinking too small, Dad," Bud would argue. "We have the resources and the influence to aim higher, to take control at the national level and reshape this country." Digby Sr., though proud of his son's ambition, was wary. "Power is built brick by brick, Bud. Recklessness will only bring ruin. We need to be strategic, patient." Bud's determination to forge his own path inevitably led to conflict and eventual estrangement from his father. The young Taraxia's decision to run for public office at a young age, without his father's explicit endorsement or financial backing, marked the beginning of a significant rift. Bud's campaign for a congressional seat was ambitious and aggressive, embodying his belief in bold action over cautious strategy. He utilized social media and modern communication techniques to appeal to a younger, more diverse electorate. While this approach brought him success and recognition, it further alienated him from Digby Sr., who saw it as a reckless gamble. The final straw came when Bud publicly criticized aspects of his father's business during a debate, attempting to distance himself from the controversial AI sex and pornography empire. "The future of this country cannot be tied to outdated and ethically questionable industries," Bud declared, a statement that reverberated through the media and struck a personal blow to his father. The ensuing fallout was severe. Digby Sr. felt betrayed, interpreting Bud's actions as a rejection of his legacy and values. The two stopped speaking, their estrangement casting a long shadow over Bud's early political career. The strains and eventual estrangement from his father had a profound impact on Bud Taraxia's personality and leadership style. The experience of asserting his independence and facing the consequences of familial conflict hardened him, reinforcing his authoritarian tendencies and his belief in self-reliance. Bud became more guarded and distrustful, a leader who valued loyalty but was wary of potential betrayals. The need to prove himself without his father's support drove him to adopt a leadership style that was both commanding and unyielding. He demanded absolute loyalty from his inner circle, often testing their commitment through challenging assignments and unwavering expectations. The estrangement also fueled Bud's desire to surpass his father's achievements. He became increasingly ambitious and relentless, viewing every political victory as a step towards vindicating his independence and proving his father wrong. This mindset contributed to his aggressive approach to governance and his willingness to push boundaries. Moreover, the conflict with Digby Sr. ingrained in Bud a deep-seated aversion to perceived weakness. He equated success with strength and control, shaping his interactions with both allies and adversaries. This approach would later define his presidency, as he navigated the tumultuous landscape of American politics with a firm hand and a clear vision of power. In the broader context of his leadership, the dynamics with his father left Bud with a complex relationship with authority. While he respected the need for hierarchical control, he also harbored a rebellious streak, a desire to challenge and redefine the status quo. This duality became a hallmark of his political identity, influencing his strategies and decisions as he rose to the highest office in the land. The morning of November 4th, 2036, dawned like any other election day, with a palpable buzz of anticipation across the nation. However, as the day progressed, reports began trickling in of widespread issues at polling stations. By noon, it became clear that something far more sinister was at play. A sophisticated cyber attack had infiltrated the election infrastructure, disrupting voting systems in several key swing states. Across the country, voters encountered malfunctioning machines, inaccessible online voting portals, and inexplicably long delays. Cybersecurity experts, who had been on high alert for potential threats, quickly identified the attack as a highly coordinated effort. The attackers had used advanced malware to corrupt the voting data and block access to backup systems, effectively paralyzing the electoral process. In the hours following the attack, disbelief and confusion reigned supreme. News networks struggled to keep up with a rapidly evolving situation, providing fragmented updates that only heightened the sense of chaos. Election officials scrambled to address the technical failures, while voters, frustrated and bewildered, faced unprecedented obstacles in casting their ballots. In Washington, D.C., President Digby Bud Taraxia monitored the unfolding crisis from the White House Situation Room. Despite the mounting evidence of foul play, initial reactions were marked by skepticism and denial. Many believed the disruptions were merely technical glitches, the result of overwhelmed systems rather than a deliberate attack. As the day wore on and the irregularities persisted, the narrative began to shift. Reports emerged of strange anomalies in voting patterns, with certain precincts reporting implausible turnout rates and suspicious vote counts. Social media erupted with accusations of hacking and manipulation, fueling public outrage and deepening the crisis. By evening, the gravity of the situation had become undeniable. Cybersecurity experts confirmed that the election systems had been compromised, and evidence pointed to a deliberate and sophisticated attack. As the scope of the breach became clear, suspicions of foul play and manipulation of election results grew. Political leaders from both parties demanded immediate action and answers. Accusations flew across the aisle, with each side blaming the other for the breach. President Taraxia, facing mounting pressure, addressed the nation in a hastily arranged broadcast. He acknowledged the severity of the attack and assured the public that every effort was being made to secure the integrity of the election. However, his words did little to quell the rising tide of suspicion and anger. Conspiracy theories proliferated, and trust in the electoral process eroded rapidly. Protests erupted in several major cities, with citizens demanding transparency and accountability. In the days that followed, the situation deteriorated further. Recounts were demanded, lawsuits were filed, and calls for an independent investigation grew louder. The nation teetered on the brink of a constitutional crisis, with the legitimacy of the election hanging in the balance. Amidst the turmoil, President Taraxia convened his inner circle to devise a strategy for navigating the crisis. His advisors, including longtime confidant Ethan Crawford, urged decisive action to restore order and credibility. It was clear that the events of Election Day would have far-reaching implications, setting the stage for a dramatic and contentious battle over the future of American democracy. In the wake of the unprecedented cyber attack on Election Day, the federal government launched a comprehensive investigation to trace the origins of the breach and identify the perpetrators. President Digby Bud Taraxia ordered the formation of a special task force, comprised of top experts from the FBI, NSA, and Department of Homeland Security. The task force, led by seasoned cybercrime investigator Agent Rachel Mendoza, faced immense pressure to deliver swift results. Initial investigations revealed that the attack had been meticulously planned and executed with military precision. The malware used was highly sophisticated, incorporating elements of zero-day exploits and advanced encryption, pointing to a state-sponsored operation. The task force worked around the clock, sifting through mountains of digital evidence and chasing down leads that spanned the globe. Recognizing the enormity of the challenge, the task force enlisted the help of leading private sector cybersecurity firms, as well as international allies with expertise in combating cyber threats. This unprecedented collaboration brought together some of the brightest minds in the field, united by a common goal: to secure the integrity of the American electoral system and bring the perpetrators to justice. Regular briefings were held in secure locations, where government officials and cybersecurity experts shared intelligence and coordinated their efforts. The investigation uncovered a complex web of digital footprints, leading them to suspect involvement from multiple actors with diverse motives. Theories ranged from foreign governments aiming to destabilize the United States to domestic groups seeking to undermine confidence in the electoral process. Despite the progress made, the investigation was hampered by the attackers' use of sophisticated obfuscation techniques. Each lead seemed to open up new layers of complexity, revealing a cyber landscape fraught with danger and deception. As the task force delved deeper into the breach, they uncovered alarming vulnerabilities in the election system. These weaknesses had been exploited by the attackers to gain unauthorized access and manipulate data. It became evident that the infrastructure, despite previous assurances of security, was woefully inadequate to defend against such sophisticated threats. The discovery sent shockwaves through the political establishment and the general public. Detailed reports highlighted flaws in both the technology and the protocols governing the electoral process. Voter databases, online registration systems, and even some voting machines were found to be susceptible to cyber intrusions. The implications for democracy were dire, with trust in the electoral process severely undermined. President Taraxia addressed the nation once again, acknowledging the vulnerabilities and pledging to overhaul the election security infrastructure. He called for bipartisan support to enact sweeping reforms aimed at fortifying the system against future attacks. However, the damage to public confidence was profound, and questions lingered about whether the results of the 2036 election could ever be considered legitimate. Amidst the turmoil, Agent Mendoza and her team continued their pursuit of the truth. The investigation became a race against time, as the nation awaited answers and the world watched closely. However, there remained a slight glimmer of hope as the task force made a breakthrough, uncovering a crucial piece of evidence that brought them closer to identifying the masterminds behind the attack. Yet, the enormity of the task ahead loomed large, with the future of American democracy hanging in the balance. In the aftermath of the cyber attack, the 2036 election results became the subject of intense scrutiny and legal challenges. Lawsuits were filed in multiple states, each alleging various forms of electoral malpractice and demanding recounts or annulments. The judicial system was inundated with cases, creating a patchwork of rulings that only deepened the uncertainty. Prominent legal scholars and constitutional experts weighed in on the crisis, debating the implications of the compromised election. The central question was whether the results could be trusted, and if not, what the constitutional remedies might be. Some argued for a complete re-election, while others contended that existing results should be validated with additional safeguards. The Supreme Court found itself at the epicenter of the crisis, with justices divided along ideological lines. Emergency sessions were convened to hear arguments from both sides, but the path to a resolution was fraught with complexity and political bias. As legal battles raged on, the political landscape became a hotbed of maneuvering and opportunism. Politicians from all parties sought to exploit the chaos to advance their own agendas. Some leveraged the situation to call for sweeping reforms, aiming to position themselves as champions of democracy. Others used the crisis to discredit opponents, accusing them of complicity in the cyber attack or of attempting to undermine the democratic process. President Digby "Bud" Taraxia, amidst the turmoil, made strategic moves to consolidate his power. He issued executive orders aimed at securing critical infrastructure and tightening control over communication networks. These actions, while ostensibly for national security, were viewed by many as efforts to suppress dissent and strengthen his grip on the presidency. In Congress, factions formed around various responses to the crisis. Some lawmakers pushed for bipartisan commissions to investigate the attack, while others called for immediate legislative action to address the vulnerabilities. The political maneuvering reached a fever pitch, with alliances shifting and backroom deals becoming the norm. Amidst the legal and political chaos, public outcry for transparency and accountability grew louder. Citizens across the country demanded clarity on the extent of the cyber attack and its impact on the election results. Grassroots movements organized protests, rallies, and digital campaigns, calling for comprehensive investigations and systemic reforms. Journalists and watchdog organizations played a crucial role in amplifying these demands. Investigative reports highlighted flaws in the electoral system and exposed attempts by various actors to manipulate the process. Whistleblowers came forward with damning evidence, further fueling the public's distrust in the establishment. In response to the mounting pressure, President Taraxia announced the formation of an independent commission tasked with investigating the cyber attack and recommending measures to safeguard future elections. This move, while seen as a step in the right direction, was met with skepticism by those who doubted the commission's impartiality. And now, with the nation teetering on the edge of a constitutional abyss, the integrity of the electoral process, the foundation of American democracy, was in question, and the path to resolution remained uncertain. As the investigation continued and the legal battles played out, the calls for a renewed commitment to transparency and accountability echoed through the halls of power, setting the stage for the next phase of the crisis. Washington, D.C. was a city under siege, not by an external enemy, but by its own political paralysis. Congress was a fractured institution, its chambers filled with a cacophony of discord. The election aftermath had left the legislative body in disarray, unable to function effectively. Partisan divides ran deep, and the controversial nature of the election had only exacerbated existing tensions. Senate Majority Leader Miriam Rhodes, a stalwart of the Democratic Party, tried to maintain order in the Senate. Across the Capitol, House Speaker Carlos Ramirez faced similar challenges, struggling to keep the House of Representatives from descending into chaos. Minority Leader Tom Anderson, a Republican with a reputation for pragmatism, found himself at odds with both his party and the opposition, trying to navigate the unprecedented political landscape. In the hallways and backrooms of Capitol Hill, deals were attempted, alliances forged and broken, as lawmakers desperately sought a way forward. The specter of secession loomed, whispered in hushed tones and hinted at in public statements, threatening the very fabric of the Union. As the federal government struggled to maintain control, reports began to surface of states refusing to recognize President Digby "Bud" Taraxia's authority. Governors and state legislators, fueled by a mixture of genuine concern and political opportunism, withheld cooperation with federal agencies, creating a patchwork of non-compliance. In California, Governor Alice Whitman held press conferences denouncing Taraxia's presidency as illegitimate, citing tyranny and a violation of states' rights. In Texas, rookie Governor Mark Jennings echoed these sentiments, calling for a special legislative session to debate the state's response. Secessionist rhetoric grew louder, with some state leaders openly advocating for independence. State legislatures were battlegrounds of their own. Heated debates over the legality and implications of secession unfolded, with constitutional experts and historians brought in to testify. Some argued secession was a legal recourse in the face of federal overreach, while others warned of economic disaster and potential military conflict. Back in Congress, the situation was no better. Legislative gridlock became the norm as factions within both the Senate and House clashed over how to respond to the growing crisis. Filibusters, walkouts, and dramatic confrontations marked the daily proceedings, leaving little room for productive dialogue. Within these factions, divisions emerged. Some members, seeing the chaos as an opportunity, pushed for a hardline stance against secession, calling for federal intervention. Others, more sympathetic to state grievances, advocated for negotiation and compromise, hoping to prevent further escalation. President Taraxia, meanwhile, saw an opportunity to consolidate his power. His administration issued a series of executive orders aimed at securing critical infrastructure and controlling communication networks. These actions, presented as measures for national security, were viewed by many as efforts to suppress dissent and strengthen his grip on the presidency. As the crisis deepened, foreign governments began to take notice. Diplomats from China, Russia, and the European Union reached out to both the federal government and secessionist states, offering support or mediation. The United States, once a beacon of stability, was now seen as a volatile entity whose future was uncertain. International media coverage amplified the crisis. Global news networks broadcast footage of riots, military movements, and political speeches, highlighting the fragility of the situation. Pundits and analysts debated the potential collapse of American democracy, with some speculating about the global ramifications. Taraxia's administration faced diplomatic challenges on multiple fronts. Efforts to maintain legitimacy and reassure allies were complicated by the narratives pushed by foreign adversaries. High-stakes diplomatic meetings added another layer of complexity to the already convoluted crisis. As weeks passed, tensions escalated. Secessionist states took concrete steps toward independence, forming alternative governmental structures and mobilizing militias. California and Texas led the charge, with other states considering similar actions. Protests and demonstrations erupted across the nation. In secessionist states, citizens took to the streets in support of independence, waving new flags and chanting slogans of freedom. In loyalist states, counter-protests called for unity and condemned the breakaway movements. Violent clashes became more frequent, illustrating the deep divisions within the country. In response, President Taraxia authorized the use of force to dismantle secessionist movements. Federal troops were deployed to enforce law and order, leading to crackdowns and mass arrests. The administration's heavy-handed approach only fueled the fire, driving more states to consider secession as a viable option. In a final, desperate effort to save the Union, congressional leaders convened emergency sessions to negotiate a compromise. Proposals included constitutional amendments, power-sharing agreements, and federal concessions to the states. The stakes could not have been higher. Federal representatives and secessionist leaders engaged in tense negotiations, each side aware that the fate of the nation hung in the balance. The dialogues were fraught with tension, as both sides struggled to find common ground. With the nation teetering on the brink, a pivotal congressional vote or a landmark agreement now loomed. The decision reached in these high-stakes negotiations would determine whether the United States remained united or splintered into fragmented entities. The nation stood at a crossroads, with its future hanging by only a thread. The nation was in turmoil. February 2036 saw an increasingly authoritarian President Digby Bud Taraxia and his administration pushing for a constitutional amendment that threatened to reshape America's foundational principles. The amendment aimed to remove states' rights to legislate on abortion and marijuana, centralizing these powers at the federal level. This bold move was presented under the guise of promoting national cohesion and security, but it sparked fierce debate and resistance across the country. The language of the proposed amendment was clear and uncompromising. It sought to strip states of their rights to independently determine abortion laws and regulate marijuana legalization. The administration argued that a unified federal stance on these issues was necessary to prevent regional disparities and social unrest. However, critics saw it as a direct attack on state sovereignty and individual liberties. The potential impact of this amendment was profound. It threatened to nullify decades of state legislation and court rulings, imposing a one-size-fits-all policy on deeply personal and contentious issues. Legal scholars and civil rights activists raised alarms about the erosion of the 10th Amendment, which reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states or the people. Congress became a battleground for heated debates. Lawmakers clashed over the amendment, with impassioned speeches echoing through the chambers. Proponents of the amendment, led by staunch Taraxia supporters, argued that national security and unity necessitated such measures. Opponents decried it as an unprecedented federal overreach that trampled on states' rights and individual freedoms. Public forums and town halls were similarly contentious. Grassroots movements sprang up overnight, with advocacy groups organizing protests and rallies. Social media buzzed with hashtags both supporting and condemning the amendment, reflecting a nation sharply divided. Legal experts took to the airwaves and op-ed pages, dissecting the amendment's constitutionality and warning of its far-reaching implications. Governors and state legislators in affected states were quick to condemn the federal overreach. States with liberal policies on abortion and marijuana, such as California and Colorado, vowed to resist the amendment. Legal challenges were swiftly filed in federal courts, arguing that the amendment violated the principles of federalism enshrined in the Constitution. Scenes of civil disobedience played out in various states. Protesters gathered outside courthouses and state capitals, demanding that their states uphold their autonomy. Acts of resistance ranged from peaceful demonstrations to more extreme measures, highlighting the deep-seated opposition to the amendment. Undeterred by the backlash, President Taraxia's administration doubled down on its support for the amendment. In televised addresses and press conferences, Taraxia dismissed criticism as partisan obstructionism, insisting that the amendment was necessary for the nation's stability and security. The media landscape was dominated by coverage of the amendment debate. Mainstream news outlets provided extensive analysis and commentary, featuring voices from both sides of the issue. Social media amplified the conversation, with viral videos of protests and speeches galvanizing public opinion. International observers expressed concern over the amendment, questioning the direction in which America's democracy was heading. As the deadline for ratification approached, tensions reached a boiling point. The nation watched with bated breath as Congress prepared to vote on the amendment. The stakes could not have been higher. The outcome would determine the future of fundamental rights and state sovereignty in America. In a dramatic and suspenseful session, Congress finally voted. The result was narrowly in favor of ratification, a decision that sent shockwaves across the country. The fallout was immediate and intense. Supporters celebrated, believing they had secured a stronger, more unified nation. Opponents, however, were galvanized by the perceived injustice, vowing to continue their fight through legal avenues and civil activism. The ratification of the amendment marked a turning point in American history. It reshaped the political landscape, intensified the divisions within the country, and set the stage for ongoing battles over the balance of power between the federal government and the states. The nation teetered on the brink of chaos. In response to escalating tensions and mounting threats, President Taraxia took an unprecedented step. With a somber expression, he signed an executive order declaring martial law. The order was met with a mix of shock, fear, and outrage. Across the country, citizens grappled with a new reality. Law enforcement officers received new directives, while military personnel prepared for deployment on United States soil. The streets, once bustling with everyday life, now buzzed with the ominous presence of armed soldiers and military vehicles. The executive order outlined the scope and provisions of martial law in chilling detail. It granted President Taraxia sweeping powers, including the suspension of habeas corpus and other civil liberties. The justification was clear. The nation faced a grave national emergency. After all, these threats presented a clear and present danger to both national security and public safety, Taraxia asserted, and this left him no choice but to take drastic action to restore order. The order allowed for curfews, mass surveillance, and the use of military force to quell unrest. It painted a picture of a nation at war with itself, with internal threats deemed as dangerous as any foreign enemy. Taraxia's administration defended the measures as necessary to protect the nation from descending into anarchy. In cities and towns across America, the immediate effects of martial law were felt. Curfews were imposed, streets were patrolled by soldiers, and surveillance cameras seemed to multiply overnight. The suspension of habeas corpus meant that citizens could be detained indefinitely without charge. Freedom of speech was curtailed, with dissenting voices quickly silenced. Concerns over the erosion of civil liberties grew louder. Legal scholars warned of the dangerous precedent being set, while civil rights activists organized underground resistance. The suspension of fundamental rights, they argued, was a betrayal of the very principles the nation was built upon. The deployment of the National Guard and federal troops brought a heavy-handed response to civilian unrest. Protests erupted in defiance of curfews, with crowds chanting for the restoration of democracy and the end of martial law. Clashes between military forces and civilians became a common sight, each confrontation escalating the tension further. Soldiers found themselves in an ethical quagmire, torn between following orders and their duty to protect the citizens. Stories of dissent within the ranks emerged, with some soldiers refusing to enforce draconian measures against their fellow Americans. The declaration of martial law dominated media coverage. Mainstream outlets reported from the front lines of protests, capturing the raw emotion and violence that unfolded. Social media became a battleground of its own, with viral videos and impassioned posts shaping public opinion. Pundits and commentators debated the implications of martial law. Some supported the president's actions as necessary to restore order, while others condemned it as a gross overreach of executive power. International observers voiced their concern, warning that the erosion of democratic norms in the United States could have far-reaching implications for global stability. Legal challenges to the martial law declaration were swiftly filed in federal courts. Civil liberties organizations argued that the executive order was unconstitutional, violating the core principles of freedom and democracy. The legal battles reached the Supreme Court, where justices deliberated on the limits of executive power and the constitutional safeguards against tyranny. As the nation held its breath, the Supreme Court prepared to issue its ruling. The tension was palpable, with the fate of American democracy hanging in the balance. Would the court uphold the president's sweeping powers, or would it strike down the declaration as an affront to the Constitution? Political pundits began to worry that the president would stack the court by adding a few of his longtime allies to the nation's existing roster of Supreme Court justices. Even the slowest-minded citizens of our formerly great nation could now see the country grappling with profound questions of democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. The decisions made in the wake of martial law would shape the future of the United States, testing the resilience of its democratic institutions and the resolve of its people alike. The nation was a powder keg. The declaration of martial law had deepened political divisions, igniting widespread unrest and pushing society to the brink. Across the country, battle lines were drawn between loyalists to President Taraxia and the burgeoning resistance movements determined to reclaim their freedoms. In the capital, streets once bustling with tourists and government workers were now arenas of conflict. Protesters clashed with heavily armed law enforcement and military forces, their chants for justice and democracy echoing against the backdrop of barricades and armored vehicles. From Washington, D.C. to the smallest towns, the atmosphere was charged with anger and fear. President Taraxia's administration ramped up its efforts to quash dissent, deploying increasingly draconian measures. News outlets critical of the regime were shut down or censored, and prominent activists and political opponents found themselves targets of mass arrests. The nation watched in horror as scenes of peaceful demonstrators being forcefully detained filled the news. Yet, with every crackdown, the spirit of defiance grew stronger. Citizens took to the streets in ever larger numbers, organized strikes, and boycotted businesses supporting the government. The administration's heavy-handed tactics only fueled the fire of rebellion, turning ordinary citizens into fierce advocates for their rights. The military's presence became an inescapable reality of daily life. Checkpoints were erected at major intersections, and drones buzzed overhead, conducting constant surveillance. The sight of soldiers patrolling neighborhoods with automatic rifles became commonplace, instilling a sense of unease and fear. In major cities, military exercises showcased the regime's strength. But these displays of power also highlighted the deepening chasm between the government and its people. Soldiers, many of whom had sworn to protect their fellow citizens, now faced the daunting task of enforcing oppressive laws. Moral dilemmas plagued their ranks as they grappled with the ethics of their orders and their loyalty to the American ideals that they once vowed to defend. As federal mandates tightened, cracks within the Union widened. Several state governments openly defied President Taraxia's orders, declaring their autonomy and refusing to implement martial law measures. This defiance sparked a wave of regional solidarity, with states banding together to resist federal overreach. Paramilitary groups and militias began to surface, aligning themselves with various factions. These groups, armed and emboldened, further destabilized the nation. Meanwhile, the international community watched with growing concern. Some foreign governments voiced their support for the opposition, while others imposed sanctions on the Taraxia regime, isolating it diplomatically. The sporadic incidents of violence soon gave way to full-blown clashes between government forces and resistance fighters. Urban warfare erupted in several cities, with guerrilla tactics employed by the resistance making the conflict increasingly brutal. Streets turned into battlefields, and the sound of gunfire and explosions became the grim soundtrack of daily life. Civilian casualties mounted, each death a stark reminder of the human cost of the conflict. The violence fed into a vicious cycle of revenge and retaliation, deepening societal trauma and entrenching divisions. Communities once bound by common goals now found themselves torn apart by violence and mistrust. Amidst the chaos, voices of reason began to emerge. Religious leaders, civil society organizations, and international mediators called for dialogue and a peaceful resolution to the crisis. They urged all sides to lay down their arms and seek common ground, emphasizing the need to heal the fractured nation. Efforts to broker ceasefires and negotiate settlements gained momentum, though the path to reconciliation was fraught with challenges. As the nation teetered on the brink of civil war, the fate of democracy and the Union hung in the balance. The dramatic conclusion saw the country poised at a crossroads, with the potential for both devastation and renewal lying ahead. The storm was gathering, and the next chapter in America's history would be written by those who chose to fight, those who chose to heal, and those who dared to hope for a future beyond the conflict. Fort Sumter, a historic symbol of America's past conflicts, stood tall as a reminder of the nation's struggle for unity. Nestled in Charleston Harbor, its stone walls had once withstood the opening shots of the Civil War. Now, in a nation teetering on the edge of another great divide, it was about to become the epicenter of a new catastrophe. In the days leading up to the bombing, key characters moved unseen through the shadows. The perpetrators, driven by a mix of ideology and desperation, meticulously planned their attack. Meanwhile, law enforcement and military personnel remained on high alert, unaware of the imminent danger. The morning of the attack dawned with an eerie calm. Tourists and historians alike wandered the grounds, soaking in the significance of the place. Then the explosion shattered the peace, and disbelief rippled through the nation. News of the terrorist bombing at Fort Sumter spread rapidly, its echoes a grim reminder of the start of the previous Civil War. In the immediate aftermath, chaos reigned. Smoke and flames engulfed the historic site, reducing parts of it to rubble. Casualties lay scattered amidst the destruction, their cries for help piercing the air. Emergency responders, law enforcement, and military units scrambled to secure the area and tend to the wounded. The nation watched in horror as images of the devastation filled their screens. Fear and uncertainty spread like wildfire, with many wondering if this marked the outbreak of a new civil conflict. The shockwaves of the attack reverberated far beyond Charleston, shaking the very foundations of the country. An intensive investigation was launched to identify the perpetrators and uncover their motives. Forensic experts scoured the site for clues, piecing together the puzzle from the remnants of the blast. Surveillance footage and intelligence reports were scrutinized, revealing a web of conspiracy that hinted at a larger, and more sinister plot. Speculation and conspiracy theories abounded, each more outlandish than the last. Was it a rogue faction of the military? Foreign agents seeking to destabilize the country? Or perhaps a deep-seated domestic insurgency? The uncertainty fueled further tension and suspicion, fracturing the fragile unity of the nation. President Taraxia's administration swiftly declared the bombing an act of domestic terrorism, vowing prompt and decisive retaliation. Security measures were heightened nationwide, with military units mobilized to prevent further attacks. Checkpoints sprang up, and cities were placed under tight surveillance. Resistance groups and paramilitary factions, emboldened by the chaos, escalated their attacks against government targets. The nation braced for a wave of violence as clashes erupted across various states. The bomb at Fort Sumter had not just shattered stone and mortar. It had ignited a tinderbox of hostilities. Political leaders and media outlets seized the moment to advance their agendas. Each side stoked fear and anger, deepening the divisions among the populace. Propaganda flooded the airwaves and social media, demonizing opposing factions and justifying acts of violence as necessary for the defense of freedom and democracy. Civilians found themselves caught in the crossfire, struggling to discern truth from manipulation. Fear for their safety became a daily reality, as the lines between friend and foe became blurred. The nation teetered on the brink, its people divided and distrustful, as the rhetoric of war drowned out calls for peace. The tension reached its peak in a dramatic confrontation at Fort Sumter. Government forces and armed insurgents clashed in a brutal battle for control of the historic site. Gunfire and explosions echoed through the ruins, marking a symbolic turning point in the new Civil War. The combat was intense, with casualties mounting on both sides. Soldiers and insurgents fought fiercely, each determined to claim victory on the hallowed grounds where the first Civil War had begun. The sight of bloodshed and destruction at Fort Sumter sent shockwaves throughout the nation, signaling the start of a long and bloody struggle for the soul of America. The first shots of the new Civil War had been fired, and as the smoke cleared over Fort Sumter, the nation knew it was entering a dark and uncertain chapter in its history. The struggle for control, for power, and for the very essence of what it meant to be American had now begun. As the conflict entered its first year, the toll on the nation was palpable. Entire communities lay in ruins, their streets lined with the charred remnants of homes and businesses. The once thriving cities now echoed with the sounds of sporadic gunfire and distant explosions. The war had scarred the land and its people, leaving a deep, unhealable wound. Key characters had emerged from the chaos, each bearing the marks of the ongoing violence. Among them were soldiers like Captain Marcus Lee, who had seen his platoon decimated in brutal urban battles, and civilians like Elena Rivera, a nurse tirelessly tending to the wounded in makeshift hospitals. Political leaders, too, bore the weight of the conflict, with Governor Alice Whitman of California struggling to maintain order in her state amidst the turmoil. The magnitude of the loss and suffering was staggering. Families torn apart, lives shattered, dreams reduced to ashes. Reflecting on the year, it was clear that the cost of this war was measured not just in lives lost, but in the hope and humanity that had been drained from the nation's soul. The military stalemate had become a grim reality. Both sides were locked in a brutal dance of trench warfare, guerrilla skirmishes, and urban battles, with neither able to gain a decisive advantage. The landscape was a patchwork of fortified positions, bombed-out buildings, and no man's lands where any movement whatsoever meant death. In the cities, the fighting was relentless. Blocks changed hands daily, leaving a trail of destruction and civilian casualties in its wake. In the countryside, guerrilla fighters struck swiftly before melting back into the wilderness, keeping government forces on constant edge. Exhaustion and attrition were the order of the day, with each side grinding down the other, inch by bloody inch. The toll on the military and civilian populations was immense. Soldiers on both sides faced harrowing conditions, while civilians caught in the crossfire suffered unimaginable hardships. Both food and medical supplies were scarce, and the relentless violence took a heavy psychological toll. The humanitarian crisis had reached epic proportions. Millions were displaced, forced to flee their homes in search of safety. Refugee camps sprang up along the borders, and in safer regions, but they were overcrowded and under-resourced. The camps themselves became microcosms of the larger conflict, with tensions and violence simmering just below the surface. Makeshift hospitals struggled to keep up with the influx of the wounded. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, often without adequate supplies or equipment. Cities and towns bore the scars of constant bombardment, their infrastructure destroyed, leaving inhabitants without access to basic necessities like clean water and electricity. International aid organizations faced monumental challenges. Logistical hurdles, security risks, and bureaucratic red tape hampered their efforts to deliver aid. Despite their best efforts, the scale of the crisis overwhelmed them, and many suffered attacks from extremist factions on both sides, further complicating their mission. As the war dragged on, radicalization and extremism took hold on both sides. Desperation and hatred fueled the rise of extremist factions and paramilitary groups. These groups carried out acts of terror and reprisal against civilian populations, exacerbating the cycle of violence and fear. Extremists exploited the chaos, recruiting disillusioned and traumatized individuals into their ranks. Their ideology of vengeance and destruction resonated with those who had lost everything. The result was a brutal escalation of violence, with civilians often caught in the crossfire. Amidst this chaos, moderate voices struggled to be heard. Efforts to promote dialogue and reconciliation were met with skepticism and hostility alike. Yet, there were those who continued to advocate for peace, risking their lives to counter the tide of extremism and find a path toward healing. Diplomatic efforts to broker ceasefires and negotiate settlements were relentless, but ultimately futile. International mediators worked tirelessly, organizing peace talks and proposing ceasefires, but their efforts were consistently undermined by deep-seated mistrust and intransigence on both sides. Scenes of failed peace talks became all too familiar. Negotiators, weary and frustrated, struggled to bridge the gap between warring factions. Each attempt at dialogue seemed only to deepen the divisions, with neither side willing to compromise or lay down their arms. International mediators and peacekeepers faced mounting challenges. They operated in a volatile environment where their neutrality was constantly questioned, and their safety was far from guaranteed. Despite their best efforts, the hope for a peaceful resolution remained elusive. The physical and psychological toll of the war was immense. Individuals and communities were left grappling with the trauma of loss and violence. Stories of resilience and heroism emerged from the devastation, as ordinary people banded together to survive and resist the ravages of war. In the heart of the conflict zones, acts of kindness and solidarity provided glimmers of hope. Neighbors shared what little they had, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly despite the risks, and resistance fighters protected their communities against overwhelming odds. As the nation marked the one-year anniversary of the conflict, the stark realities of war were impossible to ignore. The fabric of society had been torn apart, and the road to recovery seemed uncertain. Yet, amidst the darkness, there remained a glimmer of hope, a determination to rebuild, to heal, and to find a way forward. The anniversary was a somber reflection on the past year, a time to mourn the losses and acknowledge the immense challenges that lay ahead. The nation stood at a crossroads, grappling with the harsh realities of war and searching for a path to peace and reconciliation. The prolonged conflict and increasingly authoritarian measures by President Taraxia's administration ignited a spark of resistance among the populace. In communities across the nation, the seeds of civil disobedience began to take root. Ordinary citizens, inspired by historical figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, felt a growing sense of moral duty to oppose the government's oppressive actions peacefully. Amidst the turmoil, leaders of the resistance emerged. Among them were Sarah Walker, a schoolteacher turned activist, and Reverend James Davis, a charismatic preacher advocating for nonviolent protest. They organized secret meetings, teaching others about the principles of civil disobedience and the power of peaceful resistance. The initial acts of civil disobedience were small but symbolic. In cities under martial law, groups of citizens defied curfews, holding candlelight vigils and sit-ins at public squares. These gatherings, though peaceful, were met with swift crackdowns by law enforcement, leading to mass arrests and further inflaming public sentiment against the government. In one notable instance, a group of elderly women in Boston refused to comply with the rationing of essential goods imposed by the military. They staged a bread march, distributing free loaves of bread to hungry neighbors while chanting, "Bread for peace, not for war." Their act of defiance, captured on social media, went viral and inspired similar actions across the country. Realizing the need for a coordinated effort, resistance leaders like Sarah and Reverend Davis began organizing larger, more strategic protests. They utilized encrypted communication platforms to avoid detection and set up networks of safe houses for activists on the run from authorities. The resistance movement grew as people from all walks of life, students, workers, clergy, and even some disillusioned soldiers joined their ranks. Workshops on nonviolent resistance techniques were held in secret locations, teaching participants how to maintain discipline and unity in the face of violent repression. The movement adopted symbols and slogans that resonated with the public, rallying support for their cause and unifying disparate groups under a common banner of freedom and justice. In response to the growing wave of civil disobedience, President Taraxia's administration intensified its crackdown. The National Guard was deployed to break up protests, using tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse crowds. Surveillance was ramped up, with government agencies monitoring communications and infiltrating resistance groups to preempt their actions. Despite these measures, the resolve of the resistance only strengthened. Each act of government repression served to galvanize the movement, drawing international attention and sympathy to their cause. Media coverage, both domestic and international, highlighted the bravery of the protesters and the brutality of the government's response, further isolating the Taraxia administration on the world stage. Solidarity became the movement's watchword. Communities rallied around those who had been arrested or injured, providing legal support, medical care, and financial assistance to families affected by the government's crackdown. Stories of individual sacrifice and collective resilience spread, inspiring others to take a stand. One poignant example was the story of Carlos Mendoza, a young activist who was severely injured during a peaceful protest in Los Angeles. His image, holding a banner that read "Freedom for All" while standing defiantly in front of an advancing tank, became a powerful symbol of the movement. Carlos's bravery and subsequent recovery, supported by a nationwide outpouring of solidarity, underscored the movement's strength and determination. The relentless campaign of civil disobedience began to yield tangible results. Public opinion shifted dramatically as more people witnessed the stark contrast between the peaceful protesters and the violent repression they faced. Pressure mounted on lawmakers and military officials to reconsider their support for President Taraxia's policies. The resistance scored a significant victory when a federal court ruled that the government's actions under martial law violated constitutional rights. This legal triumph, combined with sustained civil disobedience, forced a reevaluation of the administration's stance. Calls for dialogue and reconciliation grew louder, with prominent figures from various sectors of society advocating for a peaceful resolution to the crisis. As the nation reached a critical juncture, the power of civil disobedience became undeniable. The movement had transformed from a series of isolated acts of defiance into a formidable force for change. With the government's authority increasingly challenged and the people's resolve unwavering, the stage was set for a pivotal chapter in the struggle for justice and freedom. In the years following the breakup of the United States, North America had become a fractured and volatile landscape. Tensions between the newly formed nations and their northern neighbor, Canada, had been simmering for months. Territorial disputes over resource-rich areas, economic competition, and stark ideological differences fueled the animosity. The most aggressive of the new American nations, the Republic of Texas, led by its first president Hector Ramirez, was eager to expand its influence and secure more territory. Prime Minister Aidan Murphy of Canada, a resolute leader with a background in military strategy, watched the developments with growing concern. Both sides bolstered their military presence along the border, and initial skirmishes erupted, leading to casualties and heightening the threat of a full-scale war. The situation reached a boiling point when President Ramirez, citing grievances over disputed territories and economic blockades, formally declared war on Canada. The declaration was broadcast with fiery rhetoric, framing the conflict as a fight for survival and expansion. In response, Canada immediately began mobilizing its military forces, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Scenes of soldiers boarding transports, tanks rolling through cities, and jets streaking across the skies became commonplace as both nations braced for the conflict. International reactions were swift, with many global powers expressing concern over the destabilization of North America. Some nations pledged support to Canada, viewing the aggression as an unjustified expansionist move by the Republic of Texas. The first clashes occurred along the contested border, with brutal battles unfolding in the dense forests and open plains. Canadian forces, well-trained and highly motivated, initially struggled to repel the Texan advances. The Republic of Texas, having invested heavily in its military, launched aggressive assaults supported by advanced artillery and air support. Scenes of aerial dogfights, naval skirmishes in the Great Lakes, and intense ground combat depicted the war's ferocity. Cities near the border were turned into battlegrounds, with civilian populations caught in the crossfire. The high casualties and widespread destruction weighed heavily on both sides, but neither was willing to back down. Determined to defend their homeland, Canadian forces regrouped and launched a series of strategic counteroffensives. Utilizing their knowledge of the terrain and superior logistics, they began to push back the Texan forces. Canadian ingenuity shone through in surprise raids, effective use of technology, and cohesive military tactics. Prime Minister Murphy's calls for international assistance were answered, with allies providing military aid and intelligence support. Scenes of Canadian troops liberating occupied towns and reclaiming lost ground inspired a surge of national pride and unity. The international community's support bolstered Canada's resolve to continue fighting despite the heavy toll. Despite suffering significant losses in the early stages of the conflict, Canadian forces began to gain the upper hand. A pivotal battle near the city of Winnipeg saw Canadian troops, led by General Lisa Tremblay, decisively defeat a major Texan contingent. This victory marked a turning point, as Canadian forces launched a series of successful offensives, reclaiming lost lands and pushing deep into enemy territory. The Republic of Texas, facing mounting casualties and logistical nightmares, saw growing disillusionment and dissent among its ranks and civilian population. Scenes of deserted Texan soldiers, protests against the war, and the crumbling morale within the Republic painted a picture of an aggressor nation on the brink of collapse. The war reached its dramatic conclusion with a decisive Canadian victory in the heart of Texan territory. The fall of Houston, the new capital of the Republic of Texas, marked the end of significant hostilities. President Ramirez, facing insurmountable pressure, was forced to surrender and accept defeat. Scenes of jubilation erupted across Canada, with celebrations in cities and towns from coast to coast. The relief of victory was tempered by the somber acknowledgement of the war's devastating human cost. Memorials and services were held to honor those who had fallen, and efforts began to rebuild the war-torn regions. As the dust settled, reflections on the conflict emphasized the importance of peace and reconciliation. Prime Minister Murphy, addressing the nation, called for unity and the rebuilding of a stable and prosperous North America. The war had tested the limits of endurance and resilience, but it also highlighted the unbreakable spirit of those who fought for their homeland and the values they held dear. The war between Canada and the Republic of Texas had come to an end, leaving the continent in a state of flux. The defeated Texan nation faced the daunting task of reconstruction and reconciliation. Its cities lay in ruins, its economy shattered, and its people traumatized by the brutal conflict. Meanwhile, Canada, victorious yet weary, sought to stabilize the region and prevent further bloodshed. The Prime Minister of Canada, alongside key political leaders and diplomats from the Republic of Texas and other newly formed nations such as Pacifica and the Great Lakes Confederation, began the arduous process of normalizing relations. The initial steps towards peacebuilding involved diplomatic outreach and efforts to mend the rifts that had torn the continent apart. These leaders understood that the future of North America depended on their ability to cooperate and build a more stable, unified region. High-level diplomatic meetings and negotiations commenced, with representatives from Canada and its neighboring nations gathering to address lingering disputes. The talks were fraught with tension, but underscored by a shared commitment to move forward. Symbolic gestures of reconciliation played a significant role in these efforts. State visits, where leaders publicly embraced former foes, joint memorials honoring war victims, and cultural exchanges aimed at fostering mutual understanding and goodwill became common. Agreements were reached on economic cooperation, trade partnerships, and joint infrastructure projects. These initiatives were designed to promote mutual prosperity and regional development. The vision of a connected and cooperative North America began to take shape as trust slowly rebuilt among the once warring nations. The post-war period saw the emergence of a new era of regional cooperation and integration. Inspired by the European Union model, the North American nations formed alliances and economic blocs to address common challenges and ensure collective security and stability. The establishment of diplomatic forums and multilateral institutions facilitated dialogue, cooperation, and conflict resolution. Organizations like the North American Council and the North American Trade Bloc were created, bringing together political, economic, and security representatives from member nations. These bodies worked to harmonize policies, promote regional development, and foster a sense of shared destiny. The dream of a unified North America, once thought impossible, began to look attainable. With internal conflicts resolved and relations with its neighbors normalized, Canada emerged as the dominant political and economic power in North America. The country's leadership, exemplified by their Prime Minister, demonstrated a commitment to regional stability and global responsibility. Canada's influence grew on the international stage as it took on a leadership role in addressing regional and global issues. From climate change initiatives to peacekeeping missions, Canada became a beacon of diplomacy and cooperation. Ottawa, the nation's capital, transformed into a hub for international diplomacy and cooperation, drawing leaders and diplomats from around the world. Stability restored and cooperation strengthened, North America entered a period of peace and prosperity unprecedented in its history. Economic growth surged as barriers to trade and travel were lifted, fostering innovation and cultural exchange. Cities thrived, industries boomed, and the quality of life improved across the continent. The optimism that pervaded North America was palpable. People enjoyed increased opportunities and connectivity, benefiting from the collaborative efforts of their governments. The region's diverse cultures flourished in an environment of mutual respect and shared goals. North America, once torn apart by conflict, now stood as a model of unity and cooperation. As the nations of North America looked to the future, leaders, citizens, and historians reflected on the remarkable journey from conflict to cooperation. They acknowledged the lessons learned from the past, the importance of dialogue, the value of empathy, and the strength found in unity. The Canadian Prime Minister addressed the entire continent whenever speaking publicly, highlighting the shared values of peace, democracy, and prosperity that now define North America. He envisioned a region that stood as a beacon of hope and progress for the world, inspiring other nations to follow its example. The journey had been long and arduous, but the outcome was a testament to the resilience and determination of the people of North America. As they embraced their newfound unity and diversity, they looked forward to a future filled with promise, ready to face the challenges of a rapidly changing world together. The fragile peace in North America was shattered as tensions between Mexico and the reunited American nations of Canada and the Republic of Texas reached a boiling point. Long-standing territorial disputes, historical grievances, and fierce competition over scarce resources fueled the animosity. Mexican President Alejandro Ramirez, a fervent nationalist, leveraged these tensions to galvanize his country, arguing that reclaiming disputed territories was a matter of national honor and survival. Political leaders and military commanders from Canada and the Republic of Texas, now working closely together, prepared to defend their hard-won peace. Newly elected Canadian Prime Minister Aidan Murphy and new Texan President Maria Santos held urgent meetings with their top generals, strategizing a defense against the looming threat. The outbreak of hostilities sent shockwaves through the populace and the international community, sparking fear of another devastating conflict on the continent. As news of the Mexican invasion spread, both Canada and the Republic of Texas swiftly mobilized their military forces. Soldiers were recalled from leave, Reserves were activated, and the production of military supplies ramped up. Joint military exercises were conducted to ensure seamless coordination between the two nations. Troops from both countries trained together, sharing tactics and resources to create a formidable united front. Scenes of civilian readiness and resilience emerged as communities prepared for the coming onslaught. Volunteers gathered to support the war effort, from manufacturing munitions to organizing supply lines. In towns and cities across the reunited American nations, citizens rallied behind their defenders, their resolve steeled by the threat of invasion. The war began in earnest with fierce fighting along the border. American and Mexican forces clashed in a series of pitched battles and skirmishes, the sky filled with a roar of aerial bombardments as fighter jets from both sides engaged in dogfights. Naval engagements off the coast saw ships exchanging heavy fire, while on the ground, soldiers fought brutal, close-quarters battles for control of strategic territories. The conflict exacted a heavy toll on both military and civilian populations. Casualties mounted, and the devastation spread across the land. Cities near the border turned into war zones, with buildings reduced to rubble and streets littered with debris. Despite the chaos, the determination of the defenders did not waver. As the war dragged on, the bond between Canadian and Texan soldiers grew stronger. They fought side by side, displaying camaraderie and solidarity in the face of a common enemy. Joint military command structures were established, allowing for coordinated operations and efficient use of resources. Scenes of civilian support underscored the unity of the reunited American nations. Communities opened their homes to displaced families, organized fundraisers to support the troops, and provided logistical aid to the military. The shared struggle fostered a renewed sense of national unity and purpose. The prolonged conflict and mounting casualties forced both sides to consider a diplomatic resolution. Intense negotiations began, marked by tense exchanges and diplomatic brinkmanship. Representatives from Canada, the Republic of Texas, and Mexico sought to protect their interests while minimizing further losses. After weeks of arduous talks, a peace treaty was finally signed. The war came to an end, but not without significant concessions. As part of the agreement, the reunited American nations ceded some disputed territories to Mexico. The news was met with mixed emotions. There was relief that the bloodshed had ended, but also sorrow and anger over the loss of land. In the aftermath of the conflict, leaders and citizens reflected on the journey of reunification. The war had tested their resolve, but it had also demonstrated the strength of their unity. Prime Minister Murphy and President Santos addressed their nations, emphasizing the importance of peace and the need to learn from the past. There were celebrations of victory and resilience, but also solemn memorials for those who had sacrificed their lives. The loss of territory weighed heavily on the continental consciousness of North America, yet it also served as a reminder of the price of freedom and the importance of solidarity. As the reunited American nations looked toward the future, there was a renewed sense of determination. The scars of war would take time to heal, but the bonds forged in conflict promised a future of peace, prosperity, and cooperation. Together, they faced the challenges of a changing world, united in their commitment to building a better tomorrow. President Digby Bud Toroxia's final year in office was a period marked by deep reflection and introspection. The once fiery and charismatic leader now spent his days in quiet seclusion, grappling with the legacy of his presidency and the dissolution of the United States. His closest advisors, loyal to the end, remained by his side, witnessing his personal reckoning. Among them were Emily Hartman, his longtime chief of staff, and General Marcus Harlan, his most trusted military advisor. They watched as Toroxia faced the harsh reality of a nation torn apart under his leadership. In his secluded study, Toroxia surrounded himself with stacks of documents, photographs, and memorabilia from his time in office. He sat at his desk, pen in hand, as he began to write his memoirs. The task was monumental, and as he wrote, his mind wandered to the pivotal moments of his presidency. Flashbacks of his meteoric rise to power, his bold decisions, and the controversial executive orders that ultimately led to the fragmentation of the United States played out in his mind. Through inner monologues, Toroxia grappled with his role in shaping the nation's destiny. He recalled the initial hopes and dreams he had for the country, the promises he made, and the visions he tried to realize. Each memory brought a mix of pride and sorrow, as he acknowledged both his achievements and his failures. As the months passed, moments of self-doubt and regret crept into Taraxia's reflections. He questioned whether he could have done more to prevent the collapse of the United States. The faces of millions of Americans who suffered due to his policies haunted him. Taraxia's inner turmoil intensified as he considered the possibility that different choices might have preserved the nation's unity. He confessed his mistakes and failures in the quiet of his study, writing with a heavy heart. He took responsibility for his role in hastening the nation's demise, admitting that his decisions had caused untold suffering. These moments of vulnerability were painful, but they were necessary for him to confront the enormity of his actions. Despite his regrets, Taraxia remained steadfast in his belief that his actions were necessary for the greater good. He rationalized that the sacrifices he demanded were crucial for the long-term stability and prosperity of the nation. From his perspective, the ends justified the means, and he clung to the idea that his vision had been noble, even if the execution had been flawed. Scenes of rationalization and justification filled his memoirs. Taraxia defended his decisions, arguing that the harsh realities of governance often required difficult choices. He struggled with the moral ambiguity of his actions, torn between his idealistic vision and the brutal consequences that followed. Gradually, moments of clarity and insight began to emerge. Taraxia started to come to terms with his legacy and the end of the United States. He sought reconciliation and forgiveness, reaching out to those he had wronged or harmed during his presidency. Letters of apology were sent, and in some cases, face-to-face meetings were arranged. These acts of contrition brought a measure of inner peace. Taraxia began to accept his place in history, flawed and complex as it was. He acknowledged that while his intentions were noble, the path he chose had led to a fractured nation. Embracing this reality allowed him to find a sense of closure. As the year drew to a close, President Taraxia completed his memoirs. The final chapters were a mix of reflections on his life, his presidency, and the lessons learned from the rise and fall of the United States. He faced his final days with a sense of acceptance, knowing that his legacy would be debated and dissected by future generations. Across the former United States, scenes of mourning and reflection unfolded. Citizens grappled with the end of an era and the loss of a unified nation. Historians, scholars, and ordinary people reflected on Taraxia's legacy, each drawing their own conclusions about his impact on the nation's history. The story of President Digby "Bud" Taraxia was one of ambition, controversy, and profound consequences. His presidency had shaped the course of the nation, leaving behind a legacy that would be studied and remembered for years to come. As the nation moved forward, the lessons of the past would guide its journey toward a new future, shaped by the echoes of a fallen nation. Josh Kappelman brings a wealth of both experience and expertise to the world of fiction writing, drawing upon his diverse professional background in the technology sector. With a master's degree in business administration from Webster University and an undergraduate degree from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, Josh, known as Cap to his friends, has navigated the dynamic landscapes of strategy consulting, technical training, and sales enablement with some of the world's largest and most iconic tech companies. Beyond the world of technology and business, Josh's interests include video production, podcasting, animation, fitness, mediocre golf, and exotic travel. His fascination with disruptive technologies such as 3D printing, cloud object storage, blockchain, AI, and quantum computing most certainly adds a layer of depth to his creative vision. Josh Kappelman's multifaceted background and love of inventiveness make for a riveting writer who truly brings a one-of-a-kind angle to the stories that he authors. His fiction novels deliver a combination of technical proficiency, storytelling expertise, and an insatiable curiosity.